As a reader, there are some genres that I just despise, like classics, historical fiction, and rom-coms. I just set those books aside with the intention of never reading them in my life, because at the end of the day, I just love fantasy way too much. But there's a problem. Lately, every single fantasy book feels like the exact same story, just in a different font. So that's why, over the next week, I'm gonna read books that are way out of my comfort zone to see if I can find a new favorite genre for me to read. And I'm gonna be real, some of these books, I am way too nervous to read. But first, we're starting with classics. Now I have a confession to make. I absolutely hate classics with a passion, and obviously I have middle school to thank for that. Now, there's two things I know about classics. Number one, they are absurdly long. I know it's ironic because I read epic fantasy books, but there is no reason for some classics to be this long. And number two, I never want to read one in my entire life, but to my surprise, I found an exception to both of those things. The book I'm reading for this genre is none other than The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, I have no idea on what this book is supposed to be about. I did read the first 2 pages at the bookstore, and to no one's surprise, I did not feel hooked or grabbed, but I am very interested to see if this short, minuscule novel can, grab me and hook me in. Now, this book was not my first pick for the classic genre. In fact, my initial pick for this was none other than the famous Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. But after some second thoughts, I decided to save this thing for later because I am not mentally prepared for this absolute catastrophe. Like, this thing is this big with minuscule letters and formatting. So for now, I'm just gonna stick with this thing. Let's get reading, shall we? This book is easily the shortest book I've ever read, with only 10 chapters and each one being about 10 pages long. So it wasn't long before I was already done with the first chapter. Okay, so I just finished the first chapter and I have some thoughts. And listen, I know I said that the first 2 pages of this thing were extremely boring when I first read it, but I take back everything I said. And it wasn't like anything big happened in the first chapter either. It was literally just a conversation, but that alone was enough to keep me intrigued. Honestly, I kind of want to read the rest of this because the first chapter set up the entire thing so well. I'm gonna keep reading and see where this goes. Without giving away any spoilers, this book is about a man named Dr. Jekyll. He is super well respected, a total gentleman, and basically everyone likes him. But then, out of nowhere, he starts getting way too involved with this really sketchy guy called Mr. Hyde. And when I say sketchy, I mean this guy is straight up terrifying. He's violent, he's cruel, and basically gives people the creeps. So naturally, as one would, Dr. Jekyll's friends are like, "Hey dude, why do you hang around this creep so much?" But Dr. Jekyll just keeps on dodging the question, saying something like, "Hey, it's fine, I trust him, just don't worry about it." Dr. Jekyll probably. But spoiler alert, you should worry about it, because things only start getting weirder and weirder. And by the time the truth comes out, it's not what anyone expected. This story has a very different vibe and plot in comparison to modern day fiction, which I think is what makes it really intriguing. You know what? I take back every bad assumption I made about this book. I went into this with low expectations because I thought I would hate this thing. And for the first time in a really long time, I'm starting to feel this feeling of, hey, I don't want this book to end yet, but it's ending. I'm surprisingly grabbed into this story in a way that I don't want to stop reading. I am genuinely so impressed by this because I am flying through this so fast. It's about to get dark outside and I've been reading for a solid hour now, and I'm almost 70% complete. There's about 30 pages more, so I'm gonna get back into reading. Yeah, I just finished reading The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I know this book might look short, which it totally is, but somehow, despite its length, this story is just really amazing. With that being said, the writing does get slightly complicated. I mean, it wouldn't be a classic otherwise, but goodness, this is so worth it. Heck, I feel so pumped for finishing this thing, I might as well pick up Crime and Punishment now. It's very intimidating, but someday, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna get to Crime and Punishment. I've thought about this for a bit, and I think I know what I'm gonna rate this one. Coming up next, To find the perfect book for this genre, I did a lot of digging. And by a lot of digging, I mean scrolling through 2 subreddits. But out of all the recommendations, there was one book that kept consistently popping up in every single subreddit. The book in question is none other than The Shining by Stephen King. I'm reading my first ever Stephen King novel. On a more serious note, I am looking forward to this. But being entirely honest, there is one thing I don't understand about the horror genre. And that's the fact that people actually get scared reading these books. I'm sorry, what? At least 50% of the people who recommended this book described it as shiver me timbers level scary. I totally understand getting scared by a movie because there's tons of things to get scared at. I mean, a movie has visuals, sound effects, jump scares, scary lighting, and so much more, so it's kinda valid. But when it comes to books, there's only ink. I mean, hey, this might just be me being an idiot. Because I have not read a single horror book in my entire life. I just hope I won't have to eat up my own words once I'm done reading this thing. With that being said, I'm gonna get to reading The Shining. I just finished about 6 chapters, which means I am really close to finishing part 1 of the book. That is some good progress if you ask me. But if you have not already noticed, I am loving this thing. This thing is genuinely so good. And take my word for it when I tell you that this book was the easiest thing to pick up ever. Y'all, Stephen King knows what he's doing. Anyways, it's getting quite late. I think I'm gonna read one more chapter before I call it a day. Well, I guess I'll see you folks tomorrow. Hopefully I don't end up waking up in a really embarrassing position. That's exactly what's gonna happen, isn't it? I made some pretty good reading progress last night before I went to bed, and I basically completed part 1 of the book, which I know might seem like a lot, but it's only 15% of the entire book. So I still have a lot more reading to do before I can even get close to finishing this thing. But hey, I'm not complaining. I'm gonna come clean and say this. I think I might have just heavily underestimated Stephen King. I know I've only finished part 1 of the book, but so far there hasn't really been any scary moments that have made me shiver in my timbers. But when I got to chapter 3, oh goodness, there was this one flashback scene that really just gave me the chills. I have no idea how to describe it, but Stephen King just painted such a gruesome image in my mind that I genuinely have to give it to him. I'm just getting into chapter 8, which means I have a lot of reading to do. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do. Here we go. Just made it to chapter 9. That last chapter was just insane. Up next, chapter 10. We're making some serious progress. Love to see it. Chapter 10 complete, on to chapter 11. This is some seriously good stuff. On to the next chapter. On to chapter 15, folks. This book is so good and I despise horror. Also, I just made it to chapter 16. I just made it to chapter 17. Holy shit. Genuinely, this book is just starting to get good. I just made it to chapter 20. And I still have like 70% remaining, which is good because all I want to do now is just keep... To put it simply, the book follows a character called Jack Torrance, who was a high school English teacher. After a series of rather unfortunate events, Jack takes on a job looking after this massive fancy hotel called The Overlook. And this is all happening in the winter season, if you couldn't tell already. And because this hotel is entirely empty during this time of year, he brings along his wife, Wendy, and his son, Danny, along with him. I mean, it seems like a pretty fun job, right? Just babysit a hotel for a few months, enjoy the snow, get some writing done, spend some time with your family in a giant abandoned hotel. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, the Overlook Hotel is not just a normal hotel. And to spice things up, Jack's son Danny has a bit of a sixth sense. I mean that literally. And this kid, he starts seeing and hearing some very unsettling things. And soon enough, the whole situation with the Overlook Hotel turns into a complete nightmare. And trust me, by the time things start going off the rails, there is no going back. It's day 3 of reading The Shining. I'm not gonna lie, I think I went a little too insane with reading this thing yesterday. Because I didn't really have anything else to do, so I decided to lock in and read a couple hundred pages. Which I totally did because now I've finished over 80% of the book. And trust me, it really was not that hard. Once you are locked into reading this thing, it's almost impossible to get out of it. And now that I've finished a solid 80% of this thing, it's safe to say that I understand why this book is so loved by so many fans. And trust me, the first 150 pages of this thing was only just a setup. Everything else that followed that 150 page mark was just pure insanity. And without a doubt, I am super excited to find out what's gonna happen in the last 20% of this book. Even if this book doesn't make you afraid or give you the creeps, I can assure you The Shining is still really good family drama. And even though The Shining is my first ever horror novel, this might just become my favorite one. I just completed The Shining, and all I've gotta say is, damn. Just take my word for it when I tell you that this book is a 6-star read. And I have never read a single horror book in my entire life. I really just need a moment to gather my thoughts here because this book has me in a... I'm speechless. Literally speechless. I don't even know if another horror book can beat this one for me. Because goodness, this book is so terrifying, but it's also so grounded. In fact, this book feels so realistic, I had to remind myself multiple times that this is just fiction. I am most definitely reading more Stephen King books in the future. Because the feeling of dread, isolation, and inevitable doom that this book brought with it was just peak fiction. I think it's obvious what I'm rating this book.